Hey guys, welcome to today's video, today's lesson. Today is going to be about bacteria and viruses. And I've got three main objectives that I want us to get out of this lesson. By the end, you will understand the difference between a bacteria and a virus. I'm going to give you examples of each of those, and when it comes to bacteria and viruses being pathogens that can harm the human body, we are going to identify ways in which both of those are treated. So first, let's think about the classification of life and how we classify living organisms. For the most part, we have learned about and follow this three-domain tree of life. One of the major domains of life being bacteria. Scientists are kind of in debate about this three-domain tree and having that be the most accurate way to classify life, and have kind of been switching towards this two-domain tree. But if you notice, bacteria is still a domain all in itself because it has these very specific characteristics that make it different from things like eukarya that include animals like us. Now, we characterize bacteria by these main characteristics. They are prokaryotes, which mean they are single-celled organisms. They're only made of one cell. They have no nucleus and no specialized organelles. So they don't have things like mitochondria or chloroplasts, and they have a single strand of DNA. Humans, on the contrary, have double-stranded DNA. We have that double helix that you have probably seen before, but bacteria is single-stranded. Some bacteria are autotrophs, meaning they can produce their own food, but some are heterotrophs and actually need to eat to survive. And as this goes without saying, they are alive. And this is going to be one of the big comparisons that I make to viruses in just a little bit. Now, bacteria are all around us, all right? They're used to culture things like cheese and yogurt and buttermilk. We can't have those things without bacteria. In your digestive system, you have all these bacteria lining your gut that for the most part are really good for you and actually help break down your food in the entire digestive process. But we know bacteria mostly because a lot of them are considered pathogens that can hurt you. If you've ever gotten food poisoning before, food poisoning is just the result of bacteria. Whatever you ate that made you sick was harboring and fostering bad bacteria that once you ate it caused harm to your body and will make you throw up and need to go to the bathroom. Salmonella is another bacterial infection. If you're ever making cookies and you want to eat that raw cookie dough, whoever's making the cookies, your mom, your grandma will tell you, no, don't eat that because you shouldn't eat raw eggs. And that is because Salmonella is a bacteria that is present in things like raw eggs or raw chicken that can be harmful to the human body. Other bacterial pathogens are things like pneumonia, syphilis, and gonorrhea, which are both sexually transmitted infections, and tuberculosis. All right, so we've got some key characteristics of bacteria. We've got some good examples, and we know where they fall on the tree of life. But let's think about viruses. Where do viruses fit in to our classification system? Let's figure that out together. Let's review cell theory, right? We went over this a few weeks ago, and it has three components, and I want us to focus on the first one, that all living things are made of cells. So in order to be a living thing, you have to be made of cells, these basic building blocks of life. And viruses are not made of cells. They do not share the characteristics that are necessary for them to be considered living things. So that's actually a huge debate in science on whether viruses are alive or not. And if you go by cell theory and how you categorize what is living versus non-living, viruses in that sense are not considered living things. Classifying them is also very difficult because where all living things share a same common ancestor, viruses do not. All three of these domains have viruses associated with them that can affect all three of these domains, and all of them evolved separately. So classifying them and figuring out where they all originated is actually very difficult. Now, because they are not made of cells, they're not considered living. They have very different characteristics than that of bacteria. Viruses cannot replicate on their own. They require a host cell. All a virus is made of is one single strand of genetic material and a protein coat. And they use that protein coat in order to enter into host cells and inject those cells with that single strand of genetic material. Then the genetic material is replicated using the replication site of the cell that it has infected. And let me give you some examples of viruses. Things like Ebola, COVID-19 that is affecting us currently, rabies, smallpox, HIV, the flu. All of those are viruses that have this same sort of structure with that protein coat and the single strand of DNA. All of them require healthy host cells in order to hijack them and have the host cell use its machinery to then replicate the viral DNA. Now, when we think about treating bacterial infections and viral infections, you cannot treat these the same way. Bacteria are most commonly treated with antibiotics. Antibiotics, if you go to the doctor, you get tested for something like strep throat, the doctor is going to prescribe you antibiotics that you need to take for several days, usually in pill form. And when you take the antibiotics, what it's actually doing is stopping the infection from growing. It's not letting the bacteria accumulate inside of you and replicate. And many antibiotics just kill the bacteria right out. Now, viruses, you cannot treat the same way. Viruses are treated by vaccines. Vaccines train your immune system to recognize future infection and remove it before it makes you sick. Now, if there's no vaccine for a viral infection, you can only treat the symptoms. And I guess the most common example of that I can think of is when you get the flu. You get the flu, you go to the doctor. Unlike when you get a bacterial infection like strep throat, the doctor has no antibiotic that they can give you in order to cure you of the flu. All the doctor is going to send you home with is maybe a prescription for a fever reducer because that is a symptom of the flu, or an antihistamine that'll stop your nose from running and getting congested. Now, what does this mean for something like COVID-19 that's affecting us today? The antibiotics that you may have taken in the past for things like strep throat, a stomach bug, food poisoning, pneumonia, those are not going to work because those treat bacterial infections. And COVID-19, not a bacteria, it's a virus. And there is currently no vaccine that has been marketed for public use. And without something like a vaccine, doctors can only recommend treatment that reduces the symptoms. For COVID-19 in particular, doctors can recommend fever reducers, things like Advil, or implement respirators for airflow to the lungs for people that are having a lot of difficulty breathing. But as of now, there is no vaccine that can cure you of having this virus or stop you from getting the virus. If we just talk a little bit more about vaccines, as a baby, most Americans are vaccinated for a bunch of different viruses. very quickly after they're born. So you have most likely been vaccinated for chickenpox, meningitis, smallpox, whooping cough, tetanus, the MMR vaccine that prevents you from getting measles, mumps, rubella, and polio. In the past, in the very near past, before a lot of these vaccines were invented, they killed many, many, many people. They can't be treated with antibiotics, so vaccines ensure that you do not get these deadly viruses. Now let's relate this really quickly to sexually transmitted infections, because some STIs are viruses and some are bacteria. Now what that means, based on what we have talked about so far, how you treat them is very different, whether you need a vaccine, whether you need an antibiotic, whether there is any treatment. And it means very different things for your health, life expectancy, and fertility if you were to happen to contract these sexually transmitted infections. When we think of bacterial STIs, some examples are chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. When we think about viral STIs, some examples are herpes, HPV, and HIV and AIDS. So when we bring this back, we know now what makes bacteria and viruses different. We have examples of each and how we treat both. But next class, we are going to go more in depth on the different bacterial and viral sexually transmitted infections and how to protect yourself from getting them and how to treat them if a treatment is available based on what we now know about bacteria and viruses. So thank you guys for coming to this lesson, and I will see you very shortly on our STI lesson. Bye guys.